Stuff to do with family overwhelms me. You know, worry or stress around family side of things, that does overwhelm me quite a bit.
William's world changed in one sharp moment. Inside Buckingham Palace, calm walls began to shake with fear. A private deal, carefully hidden for years, was no longer secret. It had Camilla's name on it, and it was now in William's hands. Courtiers whispered, doors closed fast, faces turned pale. Someone muttered, "This was never meant for the prince." The air felt heavy, like a storm waiting to break. William stood still, reading every line, feeling every word. Trust cracked, silence screamed. And as the truth settled in, one question burned hotter than the rest. What will William do now? Let's find out. The Queen Consort's calculated gamble. The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of Clarence House, casting long shadows across polished mahoganies and ancestral portraits. Camilla Parker Bowles stood before her mirror, adjusting a string of pearls with fingers that had learned over decades to never tremble in public. But alone in these quiet moments before the day's performance began, she allowed herself the luxury of contemplation. Her reflection stared back, a woman who had clawed her way from scandal's depths to stand beside the throne itself, leaving casualties and whispers in her wake. She had never been beloved. That truth sat in her chest like a stone she had learned to carry without complaint. Where Diana had floated through rooms collecting hearts like flowers, Camilla had always moved differently, calculated, watchful, patient beyond measure. She knew what people said behind cupped hands at garden parties, the words they typed furiously into comment sections, the way certain rooms fell silent when she entered. The other woman, the homewrecker, the one who shattered a fairy tale and replaced it with something altogether more pragmatic and cold. Camilla understood power not as something given, but as something taken in imperceptible increments, stolen in hallway conversations and private dinners where the real decisions happened. She had survived Andrew Parker Bowles' infidelities, public humiliation splashed across tabloids, the nation's collective hatred, and Diana's luminous shadow. She had outlasted them all through sheer stubborn endurance, never raising her voice, never making scenes, simply remaining until everyone else either accepted her presence or grew too exhausted to fight it. Her relationship with Charles had been forged in secrecy and selfishness, built on stolen hours and elaborate deceptions. She had loved him, yes, but she had also chosen him knowing full well the cost others would pay. Diana's tears meant less than Charles's happiness. The boy's confusion mattered less than her own desires. She had wanted what she wanted, and she had been willing to wait however long it took to claim it. Now, with the crown finally within touching distance, she would not allow anyone to threaten what she had spent a lifetime constructing. Charles trusted her in ways he had never trusted Diana. Where his first wife had been volatile and emotional, demanding attention and answers, Camilla offered the comfort of predictability. She laughed at his jokes about architecture, listened to his environmental concerns without judgment, and never challenged his authority in ways that made him feel small. She had learned long ago that powerful men needed to believe they were making their own choices, even when their paths had been carefully illuminated by others. But there existed one decision that bore her fingerprints entirely. A private arrangement negotiated in hushed tones with palace lawyers, crafted during those uncertain months when Elizabeth's health had failed and succession loomed like a gathering storm. The document itself sat in a locked drawer, witnessed by only 3 people, its contents known to fewer still. It outlined provisions for Camilla's role, her titles, her influence, and most crucially, guarantees about her treatment should Charles predecease her or should circumstances shift in unpredictable ways. The agreement protected her from being cast aside, from sliding back into the shadows where scandal once kept her trapped. It ensured financial security, residences, staff, and most importantly, respect. She had fought too hard and endured too much to risk being discarded like yesterday's newspaper when public opinion shifted or when palace advisors decided her presence had become inconvenient. Charles had signed it without hesitation, grateful she had asked for so little after giving so much. His advisors had signed it reluctantly, recognizing that refusing would create a crisis nobody wanted during a delicate transition. The document's existence relied upon absolute secrecy. If its contents became public knowledge, the outcry would be devastating. The British people tolerated Camilla now through exhaustion rather than acceptance, but discovering that she had negotiated special protections, that she had extracted promises and guarantees while positioning herself beside the throne, that would reignite every dormant resentment, every old wound that time had only partially healed. Camilla understood this danger intimately. She had insisted the agreement be verbal in spirit, written only because lawyers demanded documentation. She had personally selected the safe where it rested, had memorized the combination herself, had ensured that copies existed in only 2 other locations, both secured behind multiple locks and non-disclosure agreements. Nothing was uploaded digitally. No emails discussed its provisions. Even conversations about its existence happened only in rooms checked regularly for listening devices. For months, the secret held firm. Palace life continued its stately rhythms while Camilla moved through her duties with the same measured grace that had become her signature. She attended charity events and state dinners, smiled for photographers and charmed diplomats, all while knowing that beneath the surface, she had secured her position in ways the public could never imagine. She felt satisfied in those months, vindicated even, believing she had finally outmaneuvered every possible threat. Then came a Tuesday morning indistinguishable from any other until it wasn't. Camilla was reviewing her schedule when her private secretary entered wearing an expression that turned her blood cold. The secretary said nothing at first, simply closed the door with unusual care and stood waiting until Camilla set down her pen and turned her full attention toward the younger woman whose face had gone pale beneath professionally applied makeup. "There's been a breach," the secretary said, and those 3 words destroyed the careful architecture Camilla had spent months constructing. The details emerged slowly, each one worse than the last. Not a hack or a theft, but something far more damaging. A conversation overheard, words repeated to someone they shouldn't have reached, a chain of whispers that had escaped the palace walls and landed in the hands of someone with no loyalty to the institution or its inhabitants. One of the lawyers involved in drafting the agreement had mentioned it to a colleague, believing the conversation private and the colleague trustworthy. That colleague had shared it with a spouse. The spouse had friends in journalism. Now 3 different newspapers possessed enough information to construct a devastating story even without seeing the actual document. They knew such an agreement existed. They understood its general parameters. And they were making phone calls, asking questions, building narratives that would paint Camilla as everything her critics had always suspected, grasping, manipulative, concerned only with her own security and status while hiding behind the facade of dutiful service. Camilla felt the room contract around her as possibilities cascaded through her mind. Denial would look suspicious. Confirmation would be catastrophic. Attempting to suppress the story would only guarantee it appeared with even more damaging speculation attached. Every option led somewhere dangerous, every path forward littered with potential disasters that could undo decades of careful image rehabilitation. She thought of Diana suddenly, remembered the younger woman's tears and accusations, the way she had told the world there were 3 people in her marriage. Now Camilla sat in Diana's place, facing her own reckoning, discovering that even Queen's consort could not control every variable or predict every betrayal. The irony tasted bitter on her tongue. "Who?" Camilla asked finally, her voice steady despite the chaos raging beneath her composed exterior. "Who would risk everything to let this slip?" The secretary had no answer, but both women understood the question's implications. Someone in their carefully constructed circle had proven careless or disloyal or simply human in ways that palaces could not afford. And now Camilla would have to face consequences she had spent a lifetime trying to avoid, exposed once again as the calculating survivor she had always been, the woman who loved a prince but trusted only herself, the heir's burden of truth. Prince William believed in fairness with the kind of conviction that shaped every decision he made. When he spoke about homelessness or mental health, his words carried genuine feeling beneath the carefully measured delivery. He had seen his mother's compassion, watched her hold hands with AIDS patients when the world still recoiled in fear, witnessed her tears over marriages destroyed and children suffering. From her, He learned that privilege demanded service, that power meant responsibility, and that the crown only deserved respect if those who wore it acted with integrity. When it came to Camilla, William had made his peace, though peace perhaps overstated the reality. He had accepted her presence because his father loved her, and because continuing to fight would only damage everyone involved. He attended family gatherings without warmth but without open hostility, maintained polite distance, and focused on his own marriage and children rather than dwelling on past wounds. Catherine had helped him find that balance, reminding him that holding grudges poisoned only the person carrying them. The news reached him on a Wednesday afternoon in a manner so ordinary that the content felt almost surreal by contrast. He was in his private office at Kensington Palace, reviewing briefing papers for an upcoming visit to a veterans hospital, when his private secretary requested an urgent meeting. The woman's face revealed nothing as she entered and closed the door with deliberate care, but William had worked with her long enough to recognize the tension in her normally relaxed posture. "There's a situation that requires your immediate attention," she said, placing a folder on his desk with hands that remained perfectly steady. "Information has surfaced regarding a private agreement between His Majesty and the Queen Consort." William opened the folder expecting scandal of some bureaucratic variety, financial impropriety perhaps, or some misstep in protocol that would require damage control. What he found instead made his chest tighten with an anger so immediate and visceral that for a moment he couldn't form words. The document before him outlined an agreement negotiated in secret, provisions arranged to protect Camilla's position and privileges regardless of circumstances. It guaranteed her residences, income, staff, and influence even if Charles passed away or if public pressure demanded she step back from royal duties. She had negotiated protections for herself while his father was still navigating the delicate transition from heir to king, had extracted promises and assurances, had essentially secured a contract when everyone else in the family served at the pleasure of duty alone. "When was this created?" William asked, his voice coming out colder than he intended. "Approximately 14 months ago, during the period immediately following Her late Majesty's death." William felt something crack inside his carefully maintained composure. While his grandmother's body was barely cold, while the nation mourned and the family navigated the chaos of succession, Camilla had been negotiating terms, not grieving, not serving, not thinking about the institution or its future, protecting herself, securing her position, making certain that no matter what happened, she would remain comfortable and untouchable. The betrayal felt absolute. Not because she had sought security, William could understand that human impulse, but because of the timing and the secrecy. If such an agreement was reasonable and appropriate, why hide it? Why negotiate in shadows rather than presenting it openly to family members who would be affected by its terms? The answer was obvious, because she knew it would be seen as exactly what it was, a calculated maneuver by someone who had always put her own interests first, who had destroyed one royal marriage without remorse, and now sought to protect herself from any consequences of her past actions. "Who knows about this?" William asked. "Very few people are within the palace, but journalists have pieces of the story. They're asking questions." William leaned back in his chair, mind racing through implications and possibilities. His first instinct was to confront his father, to demand explanations and accountability. His second was to go directly to Camilla and tell her exactly what he thought of her manipulations. But years of training and bitter experience had taught him that immediate reactions rarely served anyone well. If he confronted his father now, Charles would grow defensive, would explain it as reasonable precaution rather than selfish calculation. He would say that Camilla had sacrificed everything for their relationship and deserved protection. He would make William feel like the unreasonable one for objecting to provisions that any sensible person would understand. The conversation would devolve into old arguments about Diana, about loyalty, about forgiveness that William had supposedly granted but apparently hadn't truly given. Going to Camilla directly would be even worse. She would adopt that expression of wounded dignity she had perfected, would speak in measured tones about duty and service, would remind him that she had endured decades of public hatred for the crime of loving his father. She would make it about her suffering rather than her actions, would deflect and minimize until William questioned his own anger. And beyond the personal dynamics, there was the institution to consider. The monarchy was already fragile, already facing questions about relevance and cost. A public fight between the heir and the queen consort would be devastating, would feed every narrative about royal dysfunction and outdated privilege. It would overshadow the legitimate work being done, would reduce complex people to tabloid caricatures once again. So William made a choice that felt like swallowing glass. He closed the folder and looked at his secretary with an expression that revealed nothing of the fury burning beneath his calm exterior. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention. I'll handle it appropriately." She nodded and withdrew, leaving William alone with his anger and the terrible realization that silence might be his only option. Not because it was right, but because speaking would cause damage he couldn't yet afford. His children would inherit this institution one day. His son George would face the same burden William now carried. Every decision had to account for that future, had to weigh immediate justice against long-term survival. The question now wasn't whether he trusted her. The answer to that was clear. The question was whether his silence represented strength and strategic thinking, or whether it marked the opening move in a conflict that would eventually consume them all. William didn't know the answer yet, but he knew that some betrayals changed things permanently, and that forgiveness once withdrawn could never be authentically restored. Is silence a sign of strength or the beginning of war? The palace holds its breath. Sir Clive Alderton had served the royal household for more than 2 decades, long enough to know when something had gone wrong even before anyone spoke the words aloud. He noticed it first in the length of meetings. Conversations that should have lasted 30 minutes concluded in 15, with participants leaving rooms more quickly than they had entered. Agendas that normally stretched across multiple topics suddenly focused on single issues, addressed with unusual efficiency and minimal discussion. People stopped lingering in hallways to exchange gossip or share observations. The informal networks that usually buzzed with speculation and analysis went strangely quiet. "Something's happened," his deputy mentioned quietly one morning as they reviewed the day's schedule. "I can't identify what, but the temperature has changed." Alderton nodded, having reached the same conclusion independently. He had seen this pattern before, during the weeks surrounding Diana's death, and again when Andrew's scandals threatened to consume the entire family. The palace in crisis mode operated differently than the palace at peace. Information stopped flowing freely. Senior staff grew protective of their principals. Junior employees learned quickly that asking too many questions could mark them as indiscreet or untrustworthy. What troubled Alderton most was the source of the tension. It wasn't external pressure from media or public opinion. That kind of crisis produced a different energy, a sense of unified defense against outside threats. This felt internal, like something had fractured within the family itself, and the staff were scrambling to understand their positions before the ground shifted beneath them completely. Camilla felt it too, though she initially tried to convince herself she was imagining things. She had survived too many storms to panic at the first sign of choppy waters, but there was no denying the subtle changes in how people interacted with her. Staff members who normally met her eyes now found reasons to look elsewhere. Conversations that should have flowed naturally felt stilted and careful. Even Charles seemed distracted, responding to her questions with unusual brevity and spending more time in his study with the door closed. The shift in William was most pronounced. He had never been warm toward her, but there had existed a kind of functional courtesy, a mutual agreement to maintain civility for Charles's sake and for the institution's stability. Now that courtesy felt different, colder and more calculated, as though William was observing her through glass rather than engaging with her as a person. When they crossed paths at family gatherings, his greetings carried no warmth whatsoever. His eyes tracked her movements with an intensity that made her deeply uncomfortable. "He knows," Camilla said to her reflection one evening as she prepared for bed. The words emerged unbidden, giving voice to the fear that had been growing steadily for days. Somehow the agreement had reached William, and everything she had carefully constructed was now balanced on the edge of disaster. Camilla considered approaching William directly, attempting to explain or justify or simply acknowledge the situation before it metastasized into something worse. But she understood William well enough to know that conversation would go badly. He possessed his grandmother's ability to listen without revealing anything, to accept explanations while silently rejecting them, to maintain perfect composure while cataloging grievances for future reference. He would let her speak, would perhaps even nod politely, and then he would continue thinking exactly what he had thought before, only now with the added satisfaction of having watched her squirm. So she chose a different strategy, pretending nothing had changed while desperately trying to identify who had betrayed her confidence and how much damage control might still be possible. She continued her schedule without alteration, attended her engagements with practiced grace, and smiled through events while her mind raced through scenarios and contingencies. But beneath the composed exterior, genuine fear had taken root. She had survived so much, had endured decades of public hatred and private humiliation, had finally achieved a position she had dreamed about since she was young. The thought of losing it now, of being exposed and humiliated once again, felt unbearable. William, meanwhile, had settled into a state of watchful waiting that suited his temperament perfectly. He made no accusations, scheduled no confrontations, and altered none of his public behavior toward Camilla or his father. To outside observers, nothing had changed, but internally William was conducting an investigation of sorts, not gathering new information, but rather re-examining everything through the lens of what he now knew. He thought about the timing of the agreement, about what it revealed regarding Camilla's priorities and character. He considered his father's complicity, the way Charles had signed something he must have known would enrage his sons if they ever discovered it. He evaluated his own previous decisions to accept Camilla's presence, wondering whether accommodation had been wisdom or weakness, whether choosing peace had simply enabled more manipulation. Catherine noticed the change in him immediately. "You're thinking about something," she said one night after the children were asleep, "something that's making you angry in ways you're trying to hide." William considered deflecting, but decided against it. He told her about the agreement, watching her face shift from confusion to understanding, to the same quiet fury he felt burning in his own chest. They talked for hours that night, weighing options and consequences, trying to determine whether speaking out would serve justice or simply cause destruction. In the end, they reached no clear conclusions, only the shared recognition that some betrayals change things permanently. Alderton watched it all with the detachment of someone who had seen royal dramas unfold too many times to be shocked anymore. He understood that the real power in these situations belonged not to whoever spoke loudest or acted most dramatically, but to whoever maintained control while everyone else lost theirs. And right now, that person was clearly William, composed, patient, and absolutely certain of his position. When the heir waits, who is truly in control? The answer was becoming increasingly obvious to anyone paying attention. Not the queen consort with her carefully negotiated protections, not the king with his authority and title, but the future sovereign who understood that time and silence could be weapons more effective than any confrontation, and who was willing to use both until the moment came for action rather than restraint. The king between two loyalties. Charles possessed a gentleness that people often missed beneath the formality and occasional petulance. He cried during classical music performances that moved him. He wrote long, thoughtful letters to friends and strangers alike, wrestling with ideas about spirituality and purpose. He worried constantly about his sons, particularly Harry, whose departure from royal life had wounded Charles more deeply than he would ever publicly admit. He wanted desperately to be a good king, a good father, a good husband, and the increasing awareness that these roles might demand contradictory things from him had begun keeping him awake at night. The news about the agreement reached Charles not through official channels, but during a private conversation with one of his most trusted advisors. They were in his study at Clarence House, reviewing upcoming engagements, when the advisor shifted uncomfortably and cleared his throat in a way that immediately captured Charles's full attention. "There's a matter that requires your awareness," the advisor began carefully. "Information regarding the private arrangement with Her Majesty the Queen Consort has begun circulating beyond its intended boundaries. Charles felt his stomach drop. He had signed that document without extensive contemplation, viewing it as a reasonable precaution rather than anything controversial. Camilla had presented it as standard procedure, and his lawyers had raised no objections. It had seemed at the time like a sensible way to ensure her security and status regardless of what the future might bring. Now, hearing the advisor's carefully neutral tone, Charles recognized his terrible mistake. "Who knows?" he asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. "Prince William has been briefed, as have several senior staff members, and there are indications that journalists possess partial information." The room seemed to contract around Charles as implications cascaded through his mind. William knowing was perhaps the worst of all. His eldest son had finally reached a place of reluctant acceptance regarding Camilla, had maintained civility if not warmth, had focused on his own family rather than dwelling on past grievances. This revelation would destroy whatever fragile peace they had achieved. William would see the agreement exactly as it was, evidence that Camilla prioritized her own security over institutional integrity, that she had negotiated personal protections during a period when the family should have been united in grief and transition. Charles wanted to defend Camilla, to explain that she had endured decades of vilification and deserved some assurance that she wouldn't be cast aside if circumstances changed. But even as those justifications formed in his mind, he recognized how weak they would sound to someone like William, who believed duty meant accepting whatever burdens came without negotiating escape clauses or special treatment. "Schedule a meeting with Prince William," Charles said finally, his voice carrying a weariness that seemed to settle into his bones. "I need to address this directly." The meeting happened 3 days later in a private sitting room at Buckingham Palace. William arrived precisely on time, his expression revealing nothing as he greeted his father with the formal courtesy that had replaced genuine warmth in their relationship. They sat across from each other in chairs that had witnessed countless difficult conversations throughout generations of royal dysfunction. "I assume you know why I asked to see you," Charles began, attempting to find some opening that might make the conversation less painful than it was destined to become. "The agreement with Camilla," William said flatly, offering no cushion of diplomacy or pretense. "Yes, I'm aware." Charles shifted in his chair, searching for words that might bridge the gulf opening between them. "It was meant as a precaution, nothing more. Your stepmother has sacrificed enormously for our relationship, and I wanted to ensure she would be treated fairly regardless of circumstances." "During the weeks following grandmother's death," William said, his voice carefully controlled, "while the family mourned and the nation watched, she was negotiating terms for herself. That's not entirely fair, isn't it?" William leaned forward slightly, and Charles saw something dangerous flickering beneath his son's composed exterior. "Tell me, did you discuss this arrangement with Harry or me before signing it? Did you consider how it might look if it became public? Did you think about the institution at all, or only about protecting someone who has already cost this family more than anyone should have to pay?" Charles felt anger rising to match his son's, defensive instincts overwhelming his better judgment. "You have no idea what she endured, what we both endured, the hatred, the judgment, the complete absence of compassion from people who knew nothing about our actual relationship." "Because it began while you were married to my mother," William interrupted, his careful control slipping slightly. "Because children watched their mother cry while you conducted an affair with the woman who is now negotiating contracts to protect herself at the institution's expense." The conversation deteriorated from there, both men saying things they would later regret but couldn't seem to prevent in the moment. Charles accused William of cruelty and self-righteousness. William questioned his father's judgment and priorities. They argued about Diana, about duty, about what loyalty meant and who deserved it. Eventually, William stood and left without any pretense of respectful farewell, leaving Charles alone with the wreckage of whatever relationship they had managed to maintain. But beyond the personal devastation, Charles recognized a more significant problem emerging. The agreement's existence had transformed from a private family matter into something with constitutional implications. If journalists published details, questions would arise about whether Camilla had inappropriately influenced royal decision-making, whether promises had been made that compromised the crown's independence, whether the monarchy operated through personal negotiations rather than institutional principles. His advisors gathered to assess the damage and explore containment strategies. Some argued for getting ahead of the story by releasing a carefully crafted statement. Others insisted that acknowledging the agreement's existence would only fuel speculation and criticism. Charles listened to their arguments while feeling increasingly paralyzed by the impossible choices before him. He called Camilla that evening, hearing the strain in her voice as she answered. They talked in circles for nearly an hour, both seeking reassurance neither could genuinely provide. She asked whether William might eventually understand. Charles offered comfort he didn't feel, making promises he couldn't keep. When they finally said goodnight, the inadequacy of words hung between them like smoke. Charles stood at his window afterward, looking out over gardens where kings and queens had walked for centuries, each facing their own impossible decisions. His grandmother had navigated abdication crises and world wars. His mother had modernized the monarchy while preserving its essential character. Now he faced his own test, caught between the woman he loved and the son who would succeed him, between personal loyalty and institutional survival. He wanted to remain neutral, to somehow honor both relationships without choosing sides. He convinced himself that if he simply maintained steady leadership, if he refused to escalate tensions or force confrontations, the crisis would eventually pass. Time had resolved so many problems throughout his life. Perhaps it would resolve this one too. But as days passed and the silence between him and William deepened, as Camilla grew increasingly anxious and staff members navigated around the obvious tension, Charles began to understand that neutrality might not be possible. Some conflicts demanded clarity and decision. Some moments required a king to choose, even when every available choice guaranteed pain. Can a king remain neutral when his family is divided? Charles would spend the coming weeks discovering that the answer was almost certainly no, and that the cost of learning this lesson might be higher than he had ever imagined possible. When the future confronts the past. The meeting happened on a gray Tuesday afternoon in a small drawing room at Buckingham Palace, arranged under the pretense of discussing upcoming ceremonial duties. No staff members attended, no advisors hovered nearby, just the Queen Consort and the heir, sitting across from each other in chairs positioned with careful formality. Camilla spoke first, her voice steady despite the tension crackling between them. "I know you've learned about the arrangement. I wanted the opportunity to explain." "I'm listening," William said, his expression revealing nothing. She began describing the agreement as reasonable protection, emphasizing her years of service and sacrifice. "After everything I endured, I simply wanted assurance that I wouldn't be discarded if circumstances changed. Surely you can understand wanting security." "What I understand," William replied quietly, "is that while my family mourned, you negotiated terms. That tells me everything I need to know about your priorities." Camilla felt something crack inside her careful composure. "That's not fair. I've given everything to this family." "You've taken everything from this family," William interrupted, his voice still calm but carrying unmistakable force. "And now you've proven that even in the institution's most vulnerable moment, you were thinking primarily about yourself." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, Camilla defending decisions she believed justified, William listening without softening. When they finally stood to leave, both understood something fundamental had shifted. The power in the room no longer belonged to the Queen Consort with her title and position, but to the future king who would one day decide what place she held, if any, in the monarchy he would inherit. "I hope you'll reconsider your judgment," Camilla said at the door. William met her eyes with an expression that held no warmth whatsoever. "I've considered everything carefully. My judgment stands." Is this the moment the future quietly replaces the present? The palace after the storm? The monarchy had survived worse crises than this one. It had endured abdications and divorces, scandals and deaths that threatened to topple the entire institution. Through everything, it had adapted and persisted, bending without breaking, absorbing blows that would have destroyed lesser organizations. This ability to weather storms came not from strength, but from something more fundamental, an understanding that survival mattered more than pride, that continuity outweighed individual comfort, and that sometimes the only way forward was through quiet adjustments that the public would never witness or understand. In the weeks following William's confrontation with Camilla, the palace began implementing changes so subtle that outsiders would never notice them. Meetings were restructured, access was recalibrated. Influence flowed through different channels than it had before. Nothing was announced through official statements or press releases. No dramatic declarations marked the shift in power dynamics. But everyone who worked within those ancient walls understood that something fundamental had transformed, that the future had begun asserting itself in ways that gently but firmly displaced the present. Sir Clive Alderton received new instructions about routing decisions through Prince William's office before finalizing them. The guidance came wrapped in diplomatic language about preparing the heir for eventual responsibilities, but everyone recognized the reality beneath the politeness. William was no longer simply waiting for his turn. He was beginning to shape the institution according to his vision, exercising authority that technically didn't belong to him yet, but which nobody seemed willing or able to challenge. William approached this expanded role with characteristic caution, never overstepping so dramatically that it would create open conflict with his father, but consistently inserting himself into conversations and decisions in ways that gradually normalized his presence and influence. When questions arose about patronages or public messaging, William's perspective suddenly carried weight it hadn't possessed months earlier. Staff members learned that ignoring the heir's preferences created problems, while accommodating them brought smoother operations and fewer complications. Charles noticed these shifts but seemed uncertain how to address them. Confronting William would risk another painful argument and might expose the king's weakening grip on authority within his own household. Ignoring the changes meant tacitly accepting his son's gradual assumption of leadership. Caught between bad options, Charles chose passivity, telling himself that William's involvement simply reflected appropriate preparation for future responsibilities, rather than a quiet coup against his father's reign. Camilla felt the transformation most acutely. Meetings she would normally attend happened without her. Conversations stopped when she entered the rooms. Staff who had previously sought her opinion now bypassed her entirely, understanding that her influence had been quietly but decisively curtailed. She remained queen consort in title and public ceremony, but the informal power she had cultivated so carefully had evaporated almost overnight. She tried initially to reassert herself, to reclaim ground she had lost, but quickly realized that resistance would only make her position worse. William controlled the future, and everyone knew it. Fighting him would accomplish nothing except highlighting her own declining relevance. So she adapted as she had always adapted, recalibrating her expectations and learning to survive in a diminished space. Her survival instinct, honed through decades of public hatred and private humiliation, taught her when to push and when to retreat. This situation clearly demanded retreat. The palace settled into its new configuration like a building after an earthquake, still standing but with cracks running through foundations that had seemed solid. Routines continued. Ceremonies happened on schedule. The public saw nothing amiss in the carefully choreographed appearances and official photographs. But those who understood how power actually flowed within the monarchy recognized that everything had changed. William carried his expanded authority with the same careful dignity he brought to all his responsibilities. He showed no triumphalism, made no obvious displays of dominance, and maintained public respect toward both his father and stepmother. But in private conversations and small decisions that accumulated into significant influence, he was reshaping the institution according to principles he believed would ensure its survival: transparency over secrecy, service over privilege, institutional integrity over personal loyalty. The leaked agreement was never made fully public. Careful negotiations and well-placed conversations with journalists resulted in the story dying before it could fully ignite. But the internal damage couldn't be similarly contained or reversed. Trust once broken cannot be fully restored, and everyone involved understood that their relationships had been permanently altered by what had been revealed. As spring arrived and London's gardens bloomed with new growth, the palace presented its usual facade of timeless stability to the world beyond its gates. Tourists photographed the guards and marveled at the architecture. Journalists reported on official engagements and ceremonial duties. The machinery of monarchy continued its ancient rhythms as though nothing had changed at all. But inside those walls, in conversations that happened behind closed doors and decisions made without public announcement, everyone understood the truth. A transition had begun, not the formal succession that would come when Charles eventually passed away, but something more subtle and perhaps more significant. The future had stopped waiting politely for its turn and had instead begun quietly claiming space in the present. If the crown survives every storm, who pays the price each time? The answer, as always, was the people who served it. Look, those who sacrificed personal desires for institutional survival, who swallowed anger and disappointment for the sake of continuity, who learned that in royal life, winning sometimes looked exactly like losing, and that power was measured not in titles or ceremonies, but in the accumulation of small victories that nobody outside the palace would ever recognize or understand.